Here is an example of your STAR profiling question. So it will always be out of 4 marks. You'll be given the results of the sensory testing in the STAR profile, and you'll be given different sensory characteristics such as aroma, colour, thickness, saltiness and creaminess. And you'll also be given a key, and the key tells you what each number represents on the STAR profile. So for example, the aroma scored 5, which means it scored very high in aroma. So the first thing you want to do when you see this question is you want to highlight the important information in the question. So first off, it will always be an evaluate question. You'll always be given a product, so in this case it will be the soup. And finally, you'll be given a person in the question. So in this case, you're evaluating the suitability of the soup for primary school children. Lastly, what you want to do before you start to answer the question is you want to add in what each score means for each different sensory characteristic, and then add in what this means for the product. So for example, the aroma of the soup scored 5, which means it scored very high. So this might suggest that it includes strong smelling ingredients such as garlic. If we look at colour, it scored a 1, which means it scored very low. So that might suggest that there's a lack of colourful vegetables. If we look at salty, it scored high because it scored a 4 on the STAR profile, meaning that it contains a lot of salt. So sometimes you are stating the obvious, such as if it scored pretty high for salt, that means it will contain a lot of salt. So what is the question actually asking me to do? So the question will always remain the same. The STAR profile shows the results of sensory testing for a new soup. Evaluate the suitability of the soup for primary school children, and as I said before, it will always be worth 4 marks. So the first thing to note is it's an evaluate question. So remember, your structure for evaluate is you've got to give a fact, an opinion, a consequence, and if you want to, you can give a developed consequence, but they are optional. The second thing that we want to note is the product given in this question is a soup, so we do need to be specific about the soup in our answers. We also want to be specific to the primary school children in our answers, as that's the person that we are evaluating the suitability of this product for. And lastly, worth 4 marks, you've got 3 different ways that you can gain these 4 marks. You can either do 4 fact, opinion, consequences. So you can choose 4 sensory characteristics, give a fact about each of them, give an opinion, and give a consequence about each of them. You could give 3 fact, opinion, consequences. So you just choose 3 sensory characteristics, and then you might develop one of those consequences. Or lastly, you could just choose to write about 2 sensory characteristics. So you do fact, opinion, consequence twice, and you develop both of those consequences. Now we're going to go into a little bit more detail about the answer structure. So remember, it's an evaluate question, so you need to have a fact, an opinion, and a consequence. Your fact is stating what the food product scored for that characteristic. So did it score high, did it score low, and how this affects the product. It's really important that you are saying what this suggests for the product, what this indicates. So for example, if the saltiness was scoring very high, then that means it would contain a lot of salt. Your opinion is just you saying if that's a good or a bad thing, or suitable or unsuitable. And your consequence is you explaining why is this a good or a bad thing for the person in the question. Remember, we do need to be specific to the person in the question. Once you've given a fact, an opinion, and a consequence, you will gain 1 mark. Remember, your developed consequence is optional, and that's how you can gain a 2nd mark for the same characteristic. For your developed consequence, you can either add in additional detail about your consequence, or you could add in a 2nd consequence. And if you do that, you will gain an additional mark for that characteristic. So if we look at some exemplar answers, the exemplar that's shown here is for colour. So we've given the fact that the soup has been rated very low for colour. So we've interpreted the key and we've stated that it's very low for colour. indicating that no brightly coloured vegetables such as carrots has been used. So we've said what this means in terms of the product in the question, which is the soup. We've given our opinion by saying this is bad for the primary school child, and we've also been specific to this primary school child. We've mentioned them in our answer. And finally, we've given our consequence, saying about explaining why this is a bad thing for the primary school child, as it suggests the soup lacks colour and won't be eaten by the children. And again, we've been specific to the person in the question by stating it's not going to be eaten by the children. And in order to do all of those three things, that's how you will gain your first mark for colour. We could go on and develop this answer for a second mark by stating this means they will feel tired after lunch and will be unable to concentrate on their schoolwork. So again, we've been specific to the primary school children by saying they're not going to concentrate on their schoolwork. Here's an exemplar answer for thickness. So again, we've given a fact. The thickness has been rated low, so we've interpreted the scale, meaning that there will be no lumps in the soup. So again, we've suggested what this means in terms of the soup. So by having a low thickness, that means that there won't be any lumps in the soup. We've given our opinion by stating this is good for the primary school child. Again, stating the person in the question in our answer. And finally, we've given a consequence, so explaining why this is a good thing, as it will be less likely to choke on the soup. So we've stated the product as well, so we've been specific in both our fact and our consequence to the soup by stating that it's a soup we are talking about. Once you've done your fact, your opinion and your consequence, you will then gain your first mark for thickness. We could go on and develop this answer further by giving a developed consequence such as the soup has no lumps in it, it will stay on the spoon easier, so it will be easier for younger children to eat. So again, we've developed this answer further. We've given an additional consequence about there being no lumps in the soup. And we've went on to be specific to the person in the question by saying it's going to be easier for the younger primary school children to eat. Once we've done that, we will have gained our second mark for thickness. Here's one of the answers that you could give for saltiness. So the soup has a high score for saltiness, suggesting that additional salt has been added. So don't worry if you are stating the obvious, sometimes you will be. You've given your opinion, stating this is bad for the primary school child. So again, we've been specific to the person in the question. And we've also given our consequence, as this will not meet current dietary advice to reduce salt to 6 grams per day. Sometimes you might find it easier to refer back to your food for health knowledge and use nutrition type answers in these questions. So by giving our fact, our opinion, our consequence, we've got 1 mark. And then we've went on to develop this consequence and give a second, more detailed consequence for our second mark for saltiness by stating in later life this may increase the risk of high blood pressure and possibly stroke. Now remember, we are evaluating the suitability of the soup for a primary school child. It's highly unlikely that a primary school child is going to suffer from high blood pressure or have a stroke, so we do want to say that it's going to be in later life that this may happen. Our next answer is for creaminess, and again we are referring back to our knowledge that we gained in Food for Health. So we've given our fact, the soup has a high score for creaminess, suggesting that cream has been added. So again, we are stating the obvious and that's fine. We've given our opinion, being specific to the person in the question by saying this is bad for the primary school child. And we've also given our consequence, as this will increase the fat content, causing weight gain. And we've done all of this, so we've now got our first mark. We then went on to say, in later life, this may increase the risk of coronary heart disease. Again, it's going to be highly unlikely that a primary school child is going to suffer from coronary heart disease, so we've stated in later life. So we've got our second mark here. Sometimes you might find it easier to refer back to your Food for Health knowledge when you're answering these types of questions. If you had given the answer that was given on the screen for saltiness and the answer given for creaminess that was on the screen, you would have had a total of 4 marks and you could move on to the next question because you've given 2 developed consequences and 2 fact opinion consequences. On the screen right now, you will see an answer for aroma, which has scored 0 points. So although this person has given a fact, an opinion and a consequence, the first thing that is wrong with this answer is they have not stated how this affects the product in their fact. So they've interpreted the scale by saying the soup has a high score for aroma, but they've not told us what this means in terms of the soup. You can't give personal opinions suggesting it smells good, because what smells good to me might not smell good to you. So that's quite a personal opinion. So we do want to have more descriptive language than that. In our opinion, we've stated this is good, which is fine, but nowhere in our answer have we mentioned the primary school children. If we read through the consequence, as if they like the smell of the soup, so they will be encouraged to try it. The person's not specified who they are, and we've not been specific to the person in the question. If they had replaced the word they with primary school children, then they would have been specific to the person in the question. So you can now see the correct answer for aroma that would gain 1 mark in your question paper. You can see here that our fact is given. The soup has a very high score for aroma, suggesting that it has a strong smell, possibly due to garlic being added. So we've stated how this very high score for aroma is going to affect the soup, and we've said that it's going to have a strong smell, possibly due to strong smelling ingredients being added, and we've given the example of garlic here. We've also been specific in our fact and our opinion to the product and the person in the question. So we've stated that it's the soup that has a very high score for aroma, and we've also stated that this is good for the primary school child. As I said previously, you could have said as if primary school children like the smell of the soup, they will be encouraged to try it, and that would be fine. So if you want to state the person in your consequence, that's okay, as long as you're being specific somewhere in your answer to the person in the question. So by making those small changes, this person is now getting 1 mark for this question. Given on this slide and the following slide, you are given some common sensory characteristics that appear in the star profile, and you are given what that would mean in terms of the product if it scored high or if it scored low. So for instance, if you had a cake that scored high for sweetness, then that would suggest that it contains a lot of sugar. If you had a cake that was scoring low for softness, that might mean it's quite hard and dense. You may wish to pause on this screen and the next screen to have a look at these. You may wish to pause on this slide to have a look at these common sensory characteristics and see what they scored high and low in and what that would mean in terms of the product. So some top tips to keep in mind when you're answering your star profiling question. The first one, it's really important that you are being specific to the person and the product in the question. So it might be a very good idea to take a couple of seconds at the start of the paper, or the start of the question, to highlight the key information in the question. So for this question, we'd be highlighting primary school child and we'd be highlighting soup. Second, it's really important in your fact that you are stating what this means for the product. So if the flavour scored low, this would mean that there's a lack of herbs being added. So it's really important that you're stating what that suggests for the product. How have we achieved that low flavour? How have we achieved that low saltiness, etc. Finally, you might find it easier to add in developed consequences to give nutrition or food for health related answers, like those given for creaminess and saltiness.